I have seen the most violent people we have. And when I first started out with many of them, I thought they were hopeless. I thought there was nothing we could do. They were untreatable, incurable. What I discovered is I was wrong. I've known some of these men for 25 or 30 years now. People who were off the scale, who were mute, paranoid, multiple murderers, who'd been killing people even after they got into prison or jail. We were able to work with and turn around so that they haven't harmed a hair on anybody's head, you know, for the last 25 years, and in fact are engaged in constructive work. In the case of the extremes, like I just mentioned, still in a correctional institution, but in other words, not harming anybody and not harming himself, even after he had a history of killing people within the jail. So what I'm saying is you can take the most hopeless cases, and my recommendation is don't give up on anybody. There is no human being who cannot be reached at some level or another if you have the dedication and the patience and you're willing to think of it as something that has to go on sometimes not just for months or years, but for decades. Human beings can be, even dead souls can be resurrected. And we can learn something from that. We're not just doing this to be good Samaritans to, you know, these poor murderers. We are doing it also because it helps the entire human race. It helps all of us if we can learn what causes violence and how we can prevent it. And we can only learn it, I think, ultimately, from the most violent people.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. Many Americans see espionage, spying, and counterterrorism work as critical for our national security. The country has gone through many different phases, starting before the Revolutionary War, that evolved into more elaborate spy agency networks during the Civil War. By the late 19th century, the Secret Service became the Central Spy Service, and in 1908, the FBI emerged as the agency that conducted forms of domestic surveillance. Under the direction of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and then in the ensuing Cold War with Russia, increased foreign espionage led to the emergence of the CIA in 1947, and the long-standing beginnings of a relationship between private industry and government espionage work. A system that emphasized closer coordination between foreign and domestic surveillance. The next major change was the Patriot Act of 2001, which gave the government increased authority to collect and analyze private data in response to the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. We're thrilled and blessed to have Elizabeth Neumann on The Radical Imagination today to discuss her gripping new book, Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. She writes how the greatest threat to American security has shifted from international terrorism to domestic terrorism, from Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the white nationalists, modern evangelicalism, and right-wing conservatism that became the driving force behind the January 6th violent, extremist, anti-government militia attacks on the Capitol. Elizabeth served under President George W. Bush's Homeland Security Council post 9/11 as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's quite a long title. As a practicing Christian and former Republican, she brings her extensive experience in counterterrorism and her deep moral concern with how her church and American democracy has been co-opted and perverted. There's no better person than Elizabeth to help us learn, all of us, how to resist the kingdom of rage and understand a blueprint for reclaiming peace and integrity that she has developed in her work. It is really terrific to have you on,
Thank
Elizabeth.
you so much for having
Thank
me.
you.
I'm
This
delighted
is-
to be here.
This is a truly, truly important book. It just came out yesterday.
It did. Yes.
So we're right in the forefront of hearing about this from you. Let's get started. A little about your own background, how you came to write this book. This is something now that's concerned with domestic surveillance, or I should say domestic terrorism. That's something new, isn't it? And what's it in response to, and how have you played a role in this?
So I started in the Homeland Security and counterterrorism
Right.
field right after 9/11.
Right.
I was serving in the George W. Bush administration, and I was in D.C. on 9/11.
How did you get to be in that position
I
right off the bat?
was a college student in Austin, Texas.
Really? Okay.
When a guy named George W. Bush was running for governor for the second time.
There we go.
And then decided to run for president, and I had the opportunity to work on both of those campaigns. And when he won, and you remember it was that kind of dragged out election where
Yeah,
we
we
didn't
remember
know
that,
the
yes.
winner until December.
Yeah.
I came up to DC and had the opportunity to work in his administration. It very much was an amazing opportunity and experience. And I was working on domestic policy at the time, the faith-based and community initiatives. Do you remember some of those
I do.
early works? And then 9/11 happened and changed everything. And not only did it change everything in terms of the focus of that administration, it changed the focus of my career path. I made a commitment that I will do whatever it takes to make sure that Americans don't ever have to live through another 9/11 moment. And
So you were a true believer that you were really entering into some valuable work, protecting America, coming from a very fundamentalist Christian evangelical background?
I would
Or
conservative,
conservative?
evangelical, not fundamentalist.
Not fundamentalist.
That word has
Yeah.
a specific definition, and I never was in a fundamentalist church, but definitely conservative. Take scripture seriously. That kind of vein of evangelicalism. Yes.
Now, George W. Bush, was he particularly aligned with that thinking, or I guess it didn't make much difference that he wanted you to?
He was. He was. It's my understanding that he was in the Methodist Church. I mean,
Yeah.
he was a believer, but he also had some really neat people around him, like Pete Weiner and Michael Gerson, who's since passed on, who were deep people of faith and influenced the president to think about like tough issues like AIDS in Africa. And if we are, I remember the president saying that we who have been blessed with so much, have a responsibility to care for those in need. And he applied that to AIDS in Africa and the PEPFAR program, which has had tremendous results even 20 years later. And that kind of originated from some of those serious evangelical voices in his administration that influenced him. So I do think that it would be a different conversation to talk about some of the post 9/11 decisions and challenges that came from that. But I think as a president, he was a man of character and integrity, and has a strong faith that guided him.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So you were on a mission in a way, right? And so we were attacked. Then what happened? We got involved in a war with people who did not attack us.
Yes.
Okay, so what was that about? What were you doing at that point?
I was focused on Homeland Security primarily. So
okay, and so
but
what were you trying to do?
I did watch senior. I was junior staff. But I did watch senior staff, including my boss, really struggle with the decision to go to Iraq. And I think it's borne out that that was the wrong decision. I do think some of the commentary around it ascribes maliciousness or malevolence that is probably not completely accurate. There might have been one or two personalities that perhaps were viewing it through a skewed lens. But I think most people believed the intelligence that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and believed that it was the right thing to do to protect the homeland. Now, clearly at that time.
Right.
So clearly history and hindsight has borne out that that was not the case. And although it's never quite as simple as like, we just want to be able to say that was the wrong decision and everybody should have known. But if you go back to look at some of the votes on the Hill, it was a bipartisan agreement.
Yeah, I agree with you.
We were a nation that was scared. It's hard for people who didn't live through it. So you have an entire generation in the workforce now that didn't experience that. It's hard sometimes for people to remember how much that day impacted that drive to do whatever we could to protect. And sometimes, now you can see, sometimes those decisions were the wrong decisions.
And I agree. It was complicated. There was a lot going on. But again, most of the world, you know the argument I'm get to. Most of the world was all for us. Wow, this is wrong. This was, and very soon after that, as a result, again, hindsight, but as a result of going into Iraq, we became seen again as here's America, the policeman of the world, and then we extended that then to to try to destroy North Korea and Iran and Libya and the other forces of evil. So axis of evil. Yes,
axis of evil. Yes.
So here we go. That's a moral statement here. These are evil forces. And we were given a narrative that didn't include our own involvement and the involvement of various other European countries in the colonialism of these countries, or our own involvement in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Iran and putting up the Shah, which was highly unfavorable unpopular among the Iranians, and which led to his overthrow by even worse elements. Right. Now we're extremists.
We have a long track record of creating worse circumstances than we were originally trying to solve. I think about the southern border. The southern border, the challenge we face right now was in large part because of decisions made 50 years ago to go in and disrupt stable governments. And now we have unstable governments and people who are seeking peace and some that are just trying to find jobs and keep their family safe. And so they're coming to our border in numbers that we don't, quite frankly, have the resources to properly process. And so that's problematic. But if you trace it back, we were culpable in destabilizing a region. So we don't have a great track record of intervention in the world. I think we do have a decent track record of standing up to evil. And I'm glad that we are supporting Ukraine again, that foreign policy bill that passed, foreign aid bill that passed last weekend. But it's hard to find the right path there. We tend to do good things and then almost in our hubris, we just kind of overreach and overstep and assume that we know the best for everybody. And we don't. How could we know what's best for somebody halfway around the world? Or
even in our own country, for that matter.
That we could go there too. Yes.
Right. But again, just to keep on with it, because you use the term evil, so this becomes a moral issue. The Kingdom of Rage. I mean, what an interesting title for a book. And then the Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. So you've sort of been intimating make sure we get this on here so everybody can see it. Yeah. Okay. That mindset, wherever it comes from, whether it's Israeli ultra-Orthodox or fundamentalism within the Muslim world or the Christian world, isn't that more the issue, and how they may get that narrative into governmental policy and leaders? Isn't that what partly your book is about? That influence, and that has distorted not only our own good name as a country, but the church that you so much love.
I do love the church, yes.
And respect.
I use a definition of extremism, and I think definitions are really important here because we, for 20 years, have been talking about extremists, but do you know there's no definition that the federal government uses? There's no accepted definition within the international community for terrorism, for extremism. Like, it's one of those funny things that by not defining it, we're actually maybe talking past each other at times. And the definition I use comes from J.M. Berger, and he defines it as when an in-group perceives a threat to their success or survival by an outgroup and hostile action is necessary. So the first part of that definition, I would argue that our politics meets that definition every day, right? Like, we're constantly being bombarded with how our in-group is being threatened by some outgroup.
America, generally.
Yeah, like Republicans against Democrats, liberals and conservatives, the woke, the mainstream media, and the things that you hear when you turn on, any of the television shows that cater to one side or the other.
On both the left and the right.
Yes,
Let's be fair about
they do why do they do it? It works. Fear and anger are strong motivators. It gets you to click on things. It gets you to donate money to your political candidate, and it gets you to go out and vote. So we are saturated in our society in these grievance narratives that are designed to make us angry. They're designed to make us live in outrage. The problem is that we do then have some small portion of people that don't just stay in the political realm and say, therefore I'm going to go vote, or therefore I'm going to go protest and assert my First Amendment right. We do have some that say we should commit some form of hostile action against that outgroup. And hostile action, the definition that I use is a spectrum, and there's the criminal stuff that you would expect, but there's also the non-criminal stuff. And I think one of the biggest shifts we've experienced as a society in the last 10 years is that the non-criminal has become more and more permissible. So this is things like intimidation, threats, bullying, harassment. And
what you're seeing at Columbia, for example, and some in Harvard and these other
technically legal, but is it helpful? Is it moral? Is it contributing to actually achieving whatever your actual goal is? I would argue no. And I think COVID kind of unraveled some of our norms in civil society, and what started maybe 10 years ago became accelerated during the COVID period, where somehow it became permissible for us to yell at the person getting our coffee, or to yell at the flight attendants on our planes, and so much so that we had major corporations having to issue put up signs and say, you may not treat our employees poorly. We didn't have to do that 20 years ago. We kind of had a set of norms that said, you offer somebody dignity and respect, even if you're frustrated or having a bad day, or they did something you disagree with. And
certain civility.
Yes. And that brokenness of our norms is creating a pool of individuals who are now in the hostile action space, and some small percentage, not everybody, then are more susceptible to crossing into that criminal space, to crossing into violence as the solution. And that's the problem I'm trying to get at in this book is we are in the middle of a 10-year spike in domestic terrorism and violent extremism in this country. And we don't pay too much attention to it unless the attack has just happened. But if you look at the data, it's quite alarming. We have lost more people in this country to far-right extremists, and far-right is a think tank term, not a government term, but militia groups and and white power groups. So those two categories are responsible for more deaths, more plots, more attacks than ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the homeland, with the exception of 9/11. And that goes back to the 90s. So this is not a new threat. It's a threat that has been there for a while. It was kind of quiet after 9/11, and then it really took off in 2015. And at some point, you kind of have to go, are we going to do something about this? Are we okay with living with this constant fear of, I can't go to Walmart or my grocery store without, potentially having to tell my kids to duck or to run? Like, there has to be a better way.
What role do you place within these people, I'm talking psychologically, in terms of anger and hate that they're carrying around with them, and how might you identify what is it they're so angry about? Because hurt people hurt other people. We heard that a million times. So some are more susceptible. It's complicated.
It is.
Just go back to your definition of a sociologist. I would respond by saying the definition of what comes to be seen as deviant or criminal or extreme is very much part of who is defining it as such.
That is very true.
So, and there's all sorts of consequences. So how we come to see people and their behavior and what we do about it, oftentimes what we do about it makes it a lot worse. We put them in prison, we try to go after them and punish them more, the whole idea of punishment. And I'm
you're absolutely right.
This is above my pay grade here. I'm not an evangelical Christian, but the language of that is sometimes used, that the Armageddon, and there'll be rivers of blood of non-believers, billions of people. I've talked to people, really nice, wonderful people, who just will say, and I was baptized Greek Orthodox, but I identify culturally, my mother was Jewish, so, and they would just say to me flat out, and it wasn't, God, I wish the hell I'd love to see you die, but they would just simply say, yeah, you'll be one of them. I'm going to be. So,
oh gosh.
the days of what's it called? The days of
last of days. End
the
of
last day, the end
yeah.
of days.
Yeah.
So that sort of mentality. Now you get that because we're in Passover season 2. We went to Seder. You can pick some of that up also within the Old Testament, and some of the rhetoric that you hear by Israelis or on the other side goes back to past hurts and traumas that they're still reliving. How do we deal with that? Because there's other narratives, particularly in, well, what I'm more familiar with in the Jewish scriptures, where you are kind to the other,
right,
and so on. That's the adage that we're most exposed to.
Yes.
And yet, look what's happening.
Yes.
All right. I don't know. That was a convoluted question here, but
I appreciate it. And you started with the psychology.
How does that relate to what you're?
Well, you started with the psychology, and I love that you did that, because we are so prone to think about terrorism in the form of ideology. And you remember post 9/11, everybody with an idea ended up on TV trying to explain to us why people wanted to kill us, right? Like, it was hard. Like, it's normal reaction. The next mass shooting, we all wonder what was the motive, right? It's normal that we wonder that. It turns out that ideology is not actually the core driver. It creates a permission structure. Okay. It creates a way for somebody to come to the conclusion that, okay, I need to go commit an act of violence. So it plays a role, but what's actually happening in that individual, and this is coming from academics and researchers that have interviewed terrorists, they've interviewed people that have joined terrorist groups, they've read through manifestos, 20 years we've been at this, and the realization is that, okay, it's not actually ideology. What it is underlying psychosocial needs have not been met. Mm-hmm. And the core of them can kind of boil up into a need for significance and a need for belonging. Now, I need to caveat, I am vastly oversimplifying very complex
you're on to
theory,
something very important there.
But
right.
I do like to bring those two out because I think that for the average person, they're like, oh, okay, I get that. I get that there's a human need for belonging and a human need for significance. And when those things are cut short,
respect,
and
the need to not be humiliated.
Exactly.
Right.
That makes more sense why somebody might be looking for an answer to meet that need. And that's the role that ideology plays. It fills a need. It tells you a story of how to fill that need. So when your goal is to prevent more extremists or you want to prevent attacks. To prevent attacks, you want to prevent more extremists.
The violent extremists,
exactly.
Especially,
Then you kind of have to take a step back and like, how do we disrupt that radicalization process, or how do we prevent somebody from radicalizing in the first place? And so as you pull those layers back, the answer becomes, you know what we need to be engaging with is more of a public health model of violence prevention as opposed to a law enforcement model. Now, I love law enforcement. I'm glad they exist. Not that everything's perfect and there isn't need for reform there, but I don't think they need to be leading when it comes to violence prevention. I think they have a role to play when somebody crosses that criminal threshold and you can't off-ramp them. But we have got to reduce the number of people in this country that think that violence is an option. And we have way too many. The survey tells us that cognitively accepting violence as an option, the numbers are around up to 30% of adults think that there are times when, and I'm not saying like defend your family, I'm saying violence is an option for achieving your political aims. Around 30% think that from time to time that might be necessary.
Tens of millions of people.
Tens of millions of people.
We're roaming
it's just
around
way too many.
Thinking about it.
Now, most of them are not going to do anything. Most of them will never have that moment in their life that triggers them. But when your potential pool of actors is that large, it's impossible for law enforcement to disrupt that. So we've got to reduce that pool. And the way to do that is through a public health approach that prioritizes mental health professionals, educators, parents, civil society, social workers. Law enforcement has a role to play, but they don't need to be leading because the goal is not to build a case and arrest somebody and prosecute them and throw them in jail. The goal is to bring this, address what's actually wrong in this person's life. Something has happened. Something has gone wrong. They need help. Yeah. And I realize that there's a little bit of a mixed message here because there are some people that go on and commit horrific acts that are quite evil. And for the victims of that, it can be hard to hear that one of the solutions is to try to empathize. But the
rather than be vengeful.
Right. But the truth is that is how we're going to reduce the number of attacks in this country, is getting to a better understanding of why we have so many individuals in this country that think that violence is the solution to their problems. And some of that is people of goodwill and average Americans, exhausted majority is often what it's often called, standing up and saying, I'm going to reassert norms here. We're going to treat each other with respect. Right. I'm not going to support the politician that is constantly demonizing their opponent, and I'm not going to allow my child to demonize, somebody they're frustrated with. Both are important. It's like training our children, reestablishing norms in the workplace, and also holding our politicians.
This is part of the blueprint you're talking about in the book.
Yeah,
correct.
We all have a role to play. I mean, there's a need for professionals in the mental health profession to also help us with individuals that are radicalizing, but there's in the public health model, there's a primary prevention, and a secondary, and a tertiary. The secondary is that space I was describing where we need social workers, mental health counselors, educators coming together to help individuals that are
police
in a difficult
yeah,
spot.
we're interacting with
But
them.
that primary prevention, public health model, right? Like primary prevention is we go to the doctor once a year for our annual physical. We might do vaccinations, we take our vitamins, we exercise, right? We do that to keep ourselves in good health.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that in the context of radicalization, the American people have not been keeping up with good the things that you need to do to keep yourself in good health. We have allowed incivility and anger to govern how we treat each other, and so we are creating more vulnerable people that then move into that secondary space, which requires more treatment.
Who then get looked at as the problem.
Yes.
Because we're not realizing that the structural violence the system is perpetrating on people. Because as Gandhi pointed out, I mean, the most horrible violence that anyone goes through is poverty.
Yes.
And so that has all sorts of ramifications and consequences, being humiliated, disrespected, and so on. And then when you lash back in an uncivil, violent way, they become the problem. Now, Elizabeth, just for the transparency for our audience, we've only met
Yes.
a few minutes before the show, right?
That's correct.
All right. So you started talking about a clip that I am showing that you haven't seen,
Oh,
but
okay.
well, of James Gilligan, the psychiatrist, who has been was instrumental for 20 years, ran the mental health services in Massachusetts. And he brought about literally the lessening of violence, kidnappings, homicides, suicides, down to zero, and was rooted in the variable of getting an education. Those who got a 4-year college education, when they got out, the recidivism rate was 0.
Wow.
Versus what it's usually 70%. So that's the public health knowledge. But on a moral level, it's getting away from this idea of punishment, of retribution, of revenge, as difficult as it might be, because that's a never-ending issue. It's never over.
That's right.
You slap my kid, okay, get his kid, and that's what you see. What is this now? Who knows what, 5th, 6th, 7th war between Palestinians and Israel? And can you imagine? I mean, the anger and hatred that is brewing on both sides, it's only getting it worse. If we don't intervene, like you're trying to point out here.
Yeah, I mean, the cycle of violence is very hard to break.
Right.
And I mean, look, this is why...
you restrain, but not necessarily punish.
Yes.
There are people that need to be restrained.
Yes.
Exactly. And get the sort of therapeutic help.
Yes.
But a lot of people don't need that.
I think, let me see if you agree with this too. There is a need for accountability.
Agreed.
When we have people that are a part of extremist movements and they decide to disengage and we ask them why, and some of them de-radicalize, but de-radicalization is a thought process. It's much harder to measure if somebody is de-radicalized. So we focus mostly on, are you disengaging from the hate, from the extremist behavior? And one of the things that they tell us is that there was some form of accountability. And sometimes it is jail, like they did something criminal, they are held accountable. And sometimes it's more in the relationships that they have. Maybe they lose a job because somebody finds out they're associated with a neo-Nazi group, or maybe they are not able to see their child in a custody dispute and because of their extremist beliefs, right? So usually the extremist belief has cost them something, or somebody held them accountable for it, and it creates enough of a break in the cycle for them to kind of question, is this thing actually solving my problems, or is it making my problems worse? So there is a role for accountability. But the other thing that they tell us that's really important is that they had somebody in their life, or it can also be a complete stranger, who showed them empathy and love.
There you go.
And so you need both. You need the love and the empathy, and you also need the accountability.
Someone who cares.
Yes.
Couldn't agree with you more. I think the idea is that people do bad things, but they are still, every single last one of us, been made in the image of God. So there's a sort of sacredness.
Yes.
Yet we do bad things. So we've got to go beyond this punishment idea and retribution, but showing people accountable. But I would also say the larger society has to begin to take into account its role in political policy and in perpetuating segregationist policies, for example, that humiliate people. Yeah. You have to sit in the back of the bus and all that sort of. So it gets tricky. Perhaps this is the time because your work so much resembles someone we admired tremendously on this show, Reverend William Barber. And of course, we've had him on a few times. Cornel West has been on, talks so much about radical love. And
I love that phrase.
It is. It's reaching out to the other. And again, it's not excusing.
Right.
But that's the force, if we're going to change anything, that we're going to need. So here is Barber being interviewed. Now, again, he is an evangelical Christian Baptist minister leading the Poor People's Campaign. All right, let me just read this because I think it's very apropos what we're talking. So he's asked this question. Your politics flows from an understanding of love, justice, and compassion as being at the heart of the Christian faith, which, if you're a Christian, I mean, you got to believe that, right? Okay.
Right.
Which is something that presumably every Christian agrees with. You also identify as an evangelical. How do you square that with the politics of Christians? I'm thinking mostly of conservative evangelicals whose faith, this, I don't know if you want to call it, there was a great book back in the 50s called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, whose faith or true belief manifests itself politically as support for politicians and policies that seem to go against the same values that the Bible is telling us, whether it's the Hebrew Scripture or the New Testament. Okay, so this is his answer. I understand it as a form of heresy. I'm sure that makes him very popular with these. Okay. In the Bible, there was always tension between prophets and false prophets. When you look today and see so-called white evangelicalism, you have to understand they are powerful, but they are not the majority of religiosity. In this country, they are a loud, well-funded group. If you think about it, white evangelicals say they're against abortion, but they vote for candidates who've never undone Roe versus Wade. They say they're against gay people, and they've lost in their battle against gay people's rights. But what do their preferred candidates always win on when they get elected? Helping corporations. So we've got an unholy connection that you're making here too. Religion is being used as the cover for greed. The term evangelical has been hijacked in favor of corporate interests. You have to stand up and say that systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism.
Yes.
I think that's a great term that you also talk about a lot. Are interlocking injustices that require us as people of faith and people who don't necessarily come from this faith to challenge. Last sentence. If you're going to promote the faith, at least do it from the biblical foundations of love, truth, and justice. Okay, so he gets a little dig here at the end. You know, we asked to debate Jerry Falwell and Franklin Graham. They won't agree to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so your turn here on this. This is Yes, that's a lot.
Yeah, no,
take in, right?
my answer to that question would be I affirm what he has laid out there. I view the relationship between Christian culture, and I'll come back to that term in a second, and the Republican Party is idolatrous, right? Like it is taking, and this is biblical theme here, right? Like whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, throughout Scripture we see God drawing a distinction between His kingdom and the kingdom of the world, right? That and when the kingdom is splitting, when Israel is getting taken over by Babylon, a lot of it was for idolatry, but it was also for putting trust in the things of man, putting trust in political power, putting trust in foreign allies. So
religion becomes institutionalized, right?
Yes.
So Constantinople or Constantine takes over the church, right?
Jumping a few centuries ahead. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
But that's exactly right. Like throughout biblical history and the last 2,000 years of Christianity, there is always this tension between political power and the actual true faith. And where you see Christianity spread and be the most pure is when the church is persecuted. It's not when the church aligns with political power. In fact, when it aligns with political power is when you often see abuse. And
interesting, yeah. So liberation theology comes into play, or people like Martin Luther King stand up against the institutional racism that they're experiencing and their people are experiencing.
Yeah.
So it's the rebel who is bringing in the, if you will, the true meaning of what Christ was all about.
Right.
And yet, if we really took that seriously, the institutions, well, they'd be out of jobs.
That's very true. And the moment we find ourselves in, I think I don't know when the reverends made those statements, but I was thinking about, you could have said those things back in the 1980s and 1990s. That would have been true. And it's that we didn't, those of us that I refer to as the remnant in the book dedication.
Yeah.
For many of us, we didn't start
exiled. I think you used the term. I was very interested. I wanted to ask you about that. What you meant. So you're calling them the remnants.
Yes.
And that's what Barbara also talks about with the remnants of ancient Israel, or remembering. Okay, you go ahead.
No.
So that's the same thing, right? The exiled remnants of the word who remember the word, and maybe a small percentage of us do that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a biblical theme, right? Like in Christianity, New Testament in particular, we are told that this is not our home. We are told our loyalty, our allegiance is to be to Jesus, not to Caesar. Now, that doesn't mean there's also commands to give to Caesar what is Caesar, pay your taxes, and to be respectful of governmental authorities, and that God institutes governments for human flourishing and good. In Jeremiah, we get told, the Israelites get told when they've been carried off to Babylon to seek the peace of the city that you're living in. So there's nothing wrong with believers investing in their communities and seeking the flourishing of their communities.
Doesn't have to be democracy, though.
No, it does not.
And it usually isn't. It's more talking, if you will, right? Theocracy.
Well,
or do I go too far?
Well, so those commands are to people not living in theocracy. Those commands are to exiles that are living outside of Israel or outside of, in the New Testament, it is God's kingdom that is not fully here yet, but we are waiting. We are living in exile until we get to join that kingdom on the other side of this earth. And so there's a tension there. There's an already but not yet there. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy to live in that tension. But too often in church history, what you do see is that people try to use political power or money to force the kingdom now, and it's their version of the kingdom. It's not actually what Jesus teaches.
Right.
Jesus says, put the sword away. Jesus tells Pilate when he's under trial that like my kingdom's of a different world, and if it weren't, like, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you, right? Like,
he would be selling $60 Bibles today,
right? Exactly. So it's we have I'll go back to that term of cultural Christians. We have in our nation a culture that was built on Christian themes, good things about Christianity. Many people went to church growing up because that's what everybody did. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not believers,
right.
But that also doesn't mean that they are believers, right? It's just the thing that you did, especially if you're in the Bible Belt, which is where I grew up. It was the societally acceptable thing to do in the 1950s and 60s to be there on Sunday morning. It was a bit like going to your country club, right? Like, that's your social circle. There's actually a lot of sociological benefits to that. But
I see what you're saying.
I would argue that
we need to come back to some of that.
Yes.
Is that what you're getting?
It provided belonging and community, and there's good to that. But if that's all it was, if it wasn't actually a genuine faith, if you're not actually reading the scriptures and practicing the totality of what is taught in those scriptures, then what you're getting is just a paper-thin faith that crumbles under pressure, that crumbles when you experience suffering.
Yeah. It's not deep.
Exactly.
There's really no integrity to it.
I think, and I posit in the book, that we have we have a sizable portion of the Christian community that lacks deep roots. And so when trials have come, when suffering has come, and let's be honest, the entirety of society went through a massive trial during COVID. But even before then, we had a financial crisis in 2008. We had the 9/11 attacks that led to multiple wars. We have globalization that has created tremendous economic uncertainty. And if, in particular to the white Christian community, we've seen pretty dramatic changes in moral norms in the society, and
that they're fearful of. Some are.
Yes, and some are fearful.
And lashing back, and not, I'm not going to be, what's the neo-Nazis are, we will not be replaced or whatever.
Yes, the Great Replacement Theory.
The Great Replacement. So that's what they fear is going to happen, and that translates into systemic racism.
Yes.
And also Islamophobia and anti-Semitism for that.
So you have in that, like, this perfect recipe.
You got a job ahead of you here. I'm curious. Your book was came out yesterday.
Yes.
So you're going to hit a lot of the churches, right?
I have been speaking to churches the last few years,
Good.
and I hope to do more conversations with churches.
I'd love to hear what they have to say.
There's the ones that have invited me find it very refreshing because they know that there's something wrong. And they're looking for answers, and they're looking for how do we rebuild our communities, and how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because there's two pieces. One, there's been a lot of fracturing in the Christian community. A lot of churches that have been split up. Pastors have been pushed out of churches because they were preaching the gospel. And I mean, one of the most classic things that not classic. It makes it sound like it's happening all the time. More recently, one of the common things that you will hear from pastors trying to faithfully teach the scriptures is they'll teach the Sermon on the Mount, and somebody will come up afterwards and say, "Pastor, why are you teaching that woke stuff?" And he's like,
"Wow,
I'm just teaching Jesus."
Interesting.
And they associate that with wokeness, and you're like, "Well,
wow."
So
what does the pastor?
Learn something
yeah,
there.
what does the pastor say to somebody like that?
Well,
that's a education moment.
Yes,
it's a very important moment.
It is a very important moment, and I think
takes out your book.
One of the challenges that so many pastors are facing is they engage with their congregation usually like 1 to 2 hours a week. Meanwhile, your congregation, depending on what their media diet is, they may be saturating in those grievance narratives the other 6.5 days a week. And so how do you combat that?
And then we want to get rid of that pastor.
Exactly.
Or more importantly, as I'm beginning to understand, the board of trustees is really behind the rabbis, the imams, the ministers.
Yes.
They're the ones that really are calling the shots of what is presented in the pulpit or not.
Yes, and that's, I think, for those that have been trying to teach faithfully and try to develop, fully formed disciples that have deep roots, it has been hard. And so you ask what happens. Well, some of those people say, like, this is not the church for me, I'm out of here. Some of those people say, never mind, this is my church, you're out of here, pastor, like, you don't belong.
Right.
So we have a lot of broken churches these days, a lot of pastors that are exhausted from the last few years of infighting and division. And
yet more people go to church in this country than any other, right? In the Western world, 80%.
I mean,
we call ourselves a Christian nation.
We
still.
Are. So I think
identify as that.
The global South has much higher numbers of Christians than the United States now, which is a beautiful thing. And I actually think that helps the American church to realize, like, no, you're not the center of the church. The church is actually global. It's not a white Western thing.
That's so profoundly important, because I think whatever you want to call it, religion, spirituality, has to be seen as a global, because we're all in this together.
Right.
And that's what narrow-mindedness exists. I've got to tell you, I am livid. I've been to a couple of Passover and so on, Seders, and last night, and other events. The rabbis will not talk about, as to use Cornell's term, one frickin' word about the suffering of Palestinians.
Oh, no.
It can't be. That's not what the prophetic tradition's about.
Yeah.
And I talked to the rabbi last night about it. I mean, we got into he's a young guy. I've known him for years. But
they're trying to keep the peace? Is that the thinking?
Well, worse than that, I don't know what they're doing, but it's a narrow-mindedness that, sure, okay, you could have your own personal narrative. Yes, there was a certain suffering among Jews, the Holocaust, and so on, but they're not the only people. This is part of a larger phenomenon and so on. We need to begin to understand the suffering of us all.
Right.
And somehow think more universally. And I think that's what, if you want, what Christ's message, as Barbara and Cornell would say, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew. Yeah. He was an Orthodox rabbi, for Pete's sakes. So, what are we talking? How can you be anti-Semitic against your God who was an Orthodox? I mean, it gets, look, I'm not, your book is so important. I'm very excited about this. It's so important, as I was saying right before the show, that people from the church speak out.
Yes. And
have this discussion and debate and dialogue. And I admire your courage and your respect your dedication to this.
Thank you.
I really mean that. And it also, the kingdom of rage will hopefully affect our own political rage. Mm-hmm. And we've got to guard against this constant putting down of other people.
That's right. And
fearing, oh my God, the devil is coming up to the borders. No, we do need policies, yeah. But, okay, well, I just, again, want to just commend you enormously on this book, and I hope it has tremendous success.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes. Is there any final words you'd like to pass on that we haven't talked about?
I might encourage those that get a chance to listen to us. It is there's a lot of work that needs to happen within my community, and I'm committed to doing that work, and I'm committed to speaking truth and trying to speak truth in love. My target audience was not those that were obviously extremist. That is much more difficult and usually best one-on-one. And my target audience was not hardcore people that are very into their politics. But I think there's a pretty sizable number of people that used to be Republicans or maybe still, traditional Republicans, conservatives, and Christians who are concerned about what has happened in our community and want to be empowered. Like that, my goal is to empower them to start doing that healing work in our community. So that's the main object of the book. But I will say that I think for audiences that are outside, or readers that are outside of those buckets, the Christian community, conservative, Republican community, I think you'll still find it interesting. And my encouragement to those audiences would be, you can play a role in this too. There's some really practical tips in the back part of the book about how to protect our kids online, how to engage in some of the public policy issues that need to be addressed to better equip us with a public health approach to prevention. Yeah. But then there's also, a question that I like to challenge people with is what can you do to change those norms? How can we reassert civility?
And be more loving.
How can we demonstrate radical love? To break this cycle of violence, somebody has to be the disruptor. Somebody has to turn the other cheek, and that could be you. And it doesn't mean that it's your job to. Like I'm not suggesting that somebody that has never stepped foot in a church and is not a white evangelical has a responsibility to fix this community. But you have tremendous power to actually bring healing. Yeah. And if you feel called, I would encourage you to really invest in those core values and virtues that made our country great, which really was, you go back to Tocqueville talking about what made America so different. It was our civil engagement and our love of neighbor. And yeah. if we all collectively decide that that's who we want to be as a people, that transforms us.
I couldn't agree more. That's got to end on a political note. That's not what MAGA means. That's not what. One other thing I would mention too, when you say, I would go into these churches where there might be some real confrontation. Barber joined with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who was quite a right-wing racist, and he is now working with Barber together after he heard the message. So you can turn people around. And
I will right? Anywhere I'm invited, I'm happy to go and share my message.
Well, you're always invited here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this book and for your spirit. And I admire and respect you so very much.
I really appreciate
being
here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you so very, very much for seeing us here on The Radical Imagination. It's Jim Vredos. We'll see you again next week.